Welcome to this deep dive. Today, we're looking into a pretty persistent idea. The hypothesis that governments have been intentionally hiding evidence of something called the chemtrails cover-up.
That's right. We've got some source materials you sent over related to this, and our aim today is really to objectively unpack the arguments, specifically focusing on this claim of intentional concealment.
Okay, so let's start with the basics. The term itself, chemtrail, where does that come from?
Well, it's pretty clearly a blend, a portmanteau of chemical and trail.
Right, playing off contrail.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Contrail is short for condensation trail. The whole chemtrail theory hinges on the idea that the trails we see behind planes aren't just, harmless water vapor.
But that they're actually chemical or maybe even biological agents being sprayed on purpose?
Precisely. That's the core belief.
And the sources suggest this really started to gain momentum, or at least public awareness, after a U.S. Air Force report came out in 1996. Something about weather modification.
Yes, that seems to be a key point in the timeline. That report, combined with people starting to notice and question what they call unusual contrail patterns in the late 90s, well, the Air Force often found itself the target of these accusations.
So what was the link? Why did that specific report spark things? Was it admitting they were doing it?
Not exactly. The issue seems to be more about interpretation. The report was titled, Weather as a Force Multiplier, Owning the Weather in 2025. It was very much future-focused, speculative.
Ah, okay. So looking ahead, not describing current actions.
Correct. It discussed hypothetical scenarios, potential future technologies for military advantage. But for some people, reading about these potential capabilities was taken as confirmation that such things were already happening secretly.
And then the internet got involved.
Right. That interpretation spread rapidly on, early internet forums and famously through the late-night radio host Art Bell starting around 1999.
Which led to more people contacting officials worried about what they were seeing.
Definitely. Calls and letters to federal agencies reportedly increased quite a bit.
So how did the government respond to this growing concern? You mentioned agencies got involved?
They did. In 2000, there was a coordinated response.
Yeah.
The EPA, FAA, NASA, NOAA, they all put out information trying to dispel the rumors.
Explaining the science of contrails, presumably?
Yes, explaining how condensation trails form, why they sometimes persist, why they might spread out, basic atmospheric science.
But how did that land with the people who already believed something secret was going on?
Well, interestingly, for many believers, this multi-agency response wasn't reassuring. It was actually seen as more evidence for a cover-up.
How so?
The logic, it seems, was that if so many official bodies felt the need to deny it and explain it away, then the thing they were denying must be real and significant. It kind of backfired, reinforcing their suspicions.
The Air Force also put out its own specific denial, right? A fact sheet.
They did in the early 2000s.
Yeah.
They explicitly called the chemtrail theories a hoax. And importantly, they directly addressed that 1996 paper.
What did they clarify about it?
They really hammered the point that it was a strategic, hypothetical document about the future. Fictional scenarios, essentially. Not current policy, not current practice, and definitely not evidence of any ongoing weather modification programs.
Despite all these official statements, the belief clearly didn't go away.
No, it's proven very persistent. Scientists and government agencies, not just in the U.S. but globally, have reportedly stated that what people are calling chemtrails are just normal contrails, behaving as expected under certain atmospheric conditions.
Is there a strong scientific consensus on this?
Very strong. There was a survey in 2016, for instance, of 77 atmospheric chemists and geochemists.
Okay. What did they find?
Well, 76 out of the 77 participants, that's 98.7%, stated they had seen no evidence that would indicate a secret, large-scale atmospheric spraying program was happening.
And what about the evidence that believers do point to? Did the scientists address that?
Yes. They said the data typically cited by proponents, things like photos of trails or analyses of water samples, could be explained by known principles of contrail formation, or sometimes simply poor data sampling methods. There's a real gap between the scientific view and the believers' interpretations.
Let's dig into those claims then. The core idea is long-lasting trails chemicals. What are the supposed reasons for this spraying?
The alleged purposes cover a really wide range and frankly sound quite alarming. You hear things like solar radiation management, trying to control the climate.
Okay, geoengineering type ideas.
Right, but also much darker theories like psychological manipulation, population control, even biological or chemical warfare testing, just conducted secretly on the public.
And what specific chemicals are allegedly involved?
The names that come up most often are barium and aluminum salts. Sometimes polymer fibers are mentioned, or even things like thorium or silicon carbide, though less frequently.
Believers also often talk about visual differences. They say you can see that these aren't normal contrails. What do they point to?
The main things cited are duration trails, lasting for hours and hours, spreading out instead of dissipating quickly.
Okay.
Also, the patterns. People report seeing grids, crisscross patterns, parallel lines that seem unnatural.
Right.
And sometimes they'll link these trails to planes that look unmarked, or maybe military planes flying to altitudes, or in areas that seem unusual for regular flights.
So how does science explain those specific observations? Long-lasting trails, for instance.
It comes down to the conditions up there. Contrails are ice crystals. If the air at cruising altitude is very cold and has high humidity, those ice crystals won't sublimate. They won't turn back into vapor quickly.
They just hang around.
Exactly. They persist, and high-altitude winds or wind shear can spread them out, sometimes into thin, sheet-like cirrus clouds. This isn't new either. Persistent contrails have been observed and documented since at least the 1940s, well before the chemtrail term existed.
The patterns, the grids and parallel lines.
That's generally explained by air traffic patterns. Commercial flights follow designated routes, like highways in the sky, often at similar altitudes.
So you get multiple planes flying along parallel paths or intersecting paths.
That's precisely. When you look up from the ground, the persistent contrails left by several planes using these corridors can easily create the visual effect of grids or parallel lines, especially if viewed over time as wind drifts them.
Okay. Now what about physical evidence? There are photos sometimes circulated showing barrels inside planes, claimed to be spray tanks.
Yes. Those photos often show flight test aircraft. The barrels are typically just water tanks, used as ballast.
Ballast, like weights.
Exactly. They fill them with water to simulate the weight of passengers or cargo. This lets engineers test how the plane handles with different weight distributions, check its balance, its performance. It's standard practice for flight testing, nothing to do with spraying aerosols.
That makes sense. Has anyone with, say, high-level access ever weighed in? I remember Edward Snowden was asked about this.
He was. And given his unprecedented access to classified U.S. government networks, NSA, CIA, military intelligence, his statement was pretty significant.
What did he say?
He said quite clearly in an interview that despite having, in his words, ridiculous access, he searched and found absolutely zero evidence of any secret chemtrail program. Nothing.
What about testing from the ground? People collecting samples they think show chemicals falling from the sky? There was a TV report in Louisiana.
Yes, the 2007 Louisiana report. He claimed high levels of barium found in samples taken under supposed chemtrails. However, later analysis showed the testing methods were flawed.
How so?
They apparently misinterpreted the results, leading to a reported concentration far higher than what was actually present. When recalculated correctly, the barium levels were within normal, expected environmental ranges, not evidence of spraying.
And videos. There are always videos online claiming to show planes actively spraying.
All right, those circulate a lot. One common type just shows the normal aerodynamic contrails or vapor trails that form off wingtips. Especially in humid conditions or fog, it's just air disruption made visible.
Not actual discharge from nozzles.
Correct. Another famous video supposedly showing fuel dumping as chemtrails. The person who originally posted it later admitted it was just a prank. Fuel dumping is a real thing, but it's an emergency procedure for landing, not some routine spraying operation.
And it looks quite different, I imagine.
It does, and aviation experts often point out, if planes were constantly spraying chemicals, passengers sitting by the windows, especially over the wings, would surely notice. It's hard to imagine keeping something like that secret.
That's a fair point. Now, sometimes legitimate activities get pulled into this, right? Like cloud seeding or research into geoengineering.
Absolutely. Cloud seeding is a well-established technology, used for decades, usually to try and increase rainfall in dry areas. It uses specific materials like silver iodide released into clouds. It's openly discussed, often publicly funded.
Not secret.
Not secret at all. And it's very different from the alleged global, covert spraying of unknown agents described in chemtrail theories. Same with geoengineering research. Scientists are exploring ideas like solar radiation management to potentially counter climate change in the future.
But that's research, often theoretical, not a hidden ongoing program.
Exactly. But believers sometimes point to these real activities as, like, proof that the chemtrail concept is real, blurring the lines between open science or established practice and the conspiracy theory.
It really seems crucial then to understand why people believe this so strongly. Despite the scientific explanations and official denials, what drives it?
Well, a lot rests on personal interpretation of what they see in the sky, combined with online videos, anecdotes. There's often a deep distrust of official sources.
So when scientists or government agencies deny it,
That denial itself is seen as part of the cover-up. It feeds the narrative rather than dismantling it.
Mm.
It points to a potential disconnect in how scientific information is perceived or trusted by some parts of the public.
does this theory usually exist in isolation, or does it connect to broader beliefs?
It very often connects to larger conspiracy frameworks, beliefs about, a hidden global agenda. The alleged motives we discussed earlier, profit, population control, weapons testing, maybe linking it to other conspiracy mainstays like HARP, they fit into these broader narratives.
And there's often a health concern linked to it, too.
Yes, a very common element is the belief that these supposed chemtrails are toxic, causing respiratory illnesses, allergies, other health problems.
It sounds like this can become a very powerful, emotionally charged belief for people.
It really can. Studies and accounts suggest believers often feel genuine fear, anxiety, sometimes anger about this perceived threat. For some, adopting the chemtrail belief is described almost like a transformation, an awakening.
Leading to action.
Yes, sometimes activism. Attending events related to geoengineering, forming online communities, sometimes even trying unconventional things like building cloud busters based on fringe science or doing their own environmental sampling, however flawed.
Looking at the social landscape, does this theory resonate more with certain groups?
It has found significant traction within some far-right circles. Yeah. That seems linked to a pre-existing deep suspicion of government and mainstream institutions.
And mainstream media doesn't cover it much.
Not really. And when it does, it's often framed as, anti-government paranoia or unfounded conspiracy, which of course might just reinforce the belief among those within that community, an echo chamber effect.
We talked about how real events get reinterpreted, like the geoengineering funding in 2013. Are there other examples? Satire, maybe?
Oh, definitely. Satire is a huge issue online. There were articles from a known satirical site, the Nevada County Scooper, claiming politicians like Bernie Sanders or Donald Trump were addressing chemtrail reform.
And people took them seriously.
Widely shared as real news within those communities. It shows how easily satire can be missed, especially when it concerns what someone already suspects. Confirmation bias is powerful. The Trump article even used a real photo of him inside a plane with those water ballast tanks we discussed earlier.
Wow. So a real photo, misinterpreted context, presented as satire, then believed as fact.
Exactly. It's a tangled web.
And these beliefs can shape social lives, too.
Seems so. You mentioned sources pointing to things like dating sites specifically for conspiracy theorists, where belief in chemtrails might be a shared interest.
So it becomes part of identity.
It can, yeah. And it influences how unrelated events are interpreted. Like, when thousands of cattle died in a Kansas heat wave, some immediately blamed chemtrails online, ignoring the official explanation of extreme heat stress.
Even routine things get misinterpreted.
Right. Classified ads for installing cloud seeding equipment, a totally normal public works thing in some areas, have been screenshotted and shared as some kind of quiet admission of weather modification linked to chemtrails. The mundane gets twisted.
There have been other specific claims, too, about things like fake snow or forced vaccinations.
Yes, the fake snow thing pops up periodically. Videos show someone holding a lighter to snow, which turns black and seems to melt strangely.
And the claim is it's chemical-laden snow from chemtrails.
That's the claim. But the explanation is simple physics and chemistry. The black stuff is soot from the butane lighter's incomplete combustion, and snow naturally absorbs meltwater rather than dripping immediately like ice. Nothing sinister.
And the vaccination claim, Australia.
That was a completely baseless rumor, claiming Australia was using chemtrails for forced vaccinations. It seems to have been recycled misinformation related to an entirely different, unrelated trial for an oral vaccine years earlier. Just false information spreading.
It seems even official documents or statements can be pulled into the narrative. There was a mention in a U.S. bill.
Yeah, Representative Dennis Kucinich included chemtrails in a list of exotic weapon systems in a draft of his Space Preservation Act back in 2001.
Alongside things like extraterrestrial weapons, right?
Exactly. It was a pretty unusual bill that ultimately went nowhere, died in committee. But that single mention is sometimes cited by believers as official acknowledgement that chemtrails are considered a real weapon.
Despite the context and the bill's failure.
Right. And conversely, When governments like Canada in 2003 or the UK in 2005 explicitly state there's no evidence for chemtrails, and it's just contrails, those official denials are just dismissed by believers as, well, part of the cover-up again.
It seems it even influenced some local politicians during the California drought.
There were reports of some local officials reacting somewhat credulously when constituents brought up chemtrail theories during that drought period, perhaps looking for any explanation or solution. That, too, was sometimes seen as validation by believers.
So bringing it all together, the materials you examined seem to consistently offer conventional scientific explanations for all these phenomena.
They do. Whether it's the persistence of trails, the patterns, the photos, the sample analyses, the sources, point towards explanations rooted in established atmospheric science, aviation practices, and sometimes misinterpretation or flawed data collection. They align with the scientific consensus regarding contrail formation and known atmospheric research.
Yet, as we've discussed, the core belief in a secret, intentional chemtrail program persists quite strongly despite decades of scientific consensus and official denials.
It really does. And it highlights just how important critical thinking is, really evaluating the source and quality of evidence when we encounter these kinds of claims, especially online.
It definitely leaves you thinking about the underlying reasons, the social factors, the psychological drivers that allow ideas like this to take root and endure, even when contradicted by so much evidence.
Absolutely. The persistence itself is perhaps as interesting as the claims themselves, telling us something about how belief systems function and spread in the modern information age.
Thanks for listening to Conspiracist.